So welcome everybody to the 9th session of the Civics Project. Our focus today is on the subject of citizenship. I am Beth Ribet. I'm the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project, and I'm really delighted to welcome both our live Zoom audience and our subsequent listening audience via podcast, and particularly to welcome our special guest today, Professor Hiroshi Motomura from UCLA School of Law. I'm going to introduce Professor Motomura more in just a second, but I'd like to begin our discussion with a brief land acknowledgement. Repair would like to acknowledge the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tevangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Taraha Tome, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. I'd next like to, again, share a brief introduction of Professor Motomura. He has a lengthy and distinguished academic and advocacy career, so this is going to be just a brief snapshot. And for those who would like to know more about his work, you can visit his faculty page through the UCLA School of Law website. Hiroshi Motomura is the Suzanne Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law and the faculty co-director of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy at the UCLA School of Law. His books include Americans in Waiting, Immigration Outside the Law, Immigration and Citizenship, and Forced Migration. His latest publication is The New Migration Law in the Cornell Law Review. Hiroshi is the founding director of the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network, RMIAN, and served on the board of the National Immigration Law Center from 2011 through 2020. He received the UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award in 2014 and a Guggenheim Fellowship for 2018. And again, I'm really delighted to have Professor Motomura as my guest for our conversation this week about citizenship. And for those who are watching the live meeting, also happy to welcome my cat, Harriet, who's just jumped on screen. So I'd like to first ask you, I'd like to first thank you, Professor Motomura. I really appreciate you taking the time to join this conversation today. And I'd like to just start by asking if you can say a little bit about citizenship in general terms for our lay audience. What is citizenship? What purpose does it serve in the United States and in other nations around the world? What's at stake when we talk about it?
Yeah, thank you, Beth. Thanks for inviting me to spend this time with you. I mean, this is a very important topic, and I really appreciate just organizing this and everyone in the live audience and also watching this, listening to this later for participating. So, I mean, you ask a really fundamental question, and you know, it's I think it boils down to this. Let me say a couple things and try to explain them, but I think it might help if I just sort of lay out the two things at the outset. One is that citizenship is something that can be used to exclude people and to include people. You can say people aren't citizens, so exclude them, and you can include people somehow, and it's giving a sense of belonging by saying they are citizens. And so I think it's useful to think about citizenship as being exclusionary on the one hand and inclusionary on the other. And the other thing, which in some ways is closely related, is the idea that citizenship, I think, is necessary for belonging, but it's never sufficient. Okay, so I think, let me just take a second and explain both of those, and then Beth, if you want to follow up or anything that's not clear, I can try to explain. But you know, the first is the idea that citizenship is something that can be used to exclude people, and also something that can be used to include people. Well, the exclusionary part, and some of this may be very obvious, but just stated anyway. You know, a famous legal scholar once said that it's much easier to say someone's not a citizen than to say that someone's not a person. And so throughout history, people have been treated very badly, even cruelly and inhumanely. And often the first step is to say, well, we can do this to you because you're not a citizen. And so citizenship is used to exclude, and in many ways, that's what borders do. We treat people worse if they're not U.S. citizens um, than if they are U.S. citizens. And so, and we have elaborate rules, which we can talk about later in the conversation about how you get to be a citizen. But one of the things that citizenship does is it kind of sets up a barrier. It's not a physical wall, but it's really a wall around the people, the belonging. It's saying some people belong and some people don't. Some people are members, some people aren't. We can treat the members better than we treat non-members. And so in that sense, citizenship is really exclusionary. There's a long history of the use of citizenship for this purpose in many societies. And we can focus on US if that makes sense during the conversation. So that's the exclusionary part. What's the inclusionary part? Well, citizenship has a lot of inclusionary potentials, and in many ways, you can think about the civil rights movement as a movement to claim the rights of citizenship. Claim the rights of citizenship people would stand up and say, "Hey, I'm a U.S. citizen. Why are you treating me this badly?" And it could be racial discrimination, it could be gender discrimination, all kinds of things. But often the claim is, "Hey, I'm a citizen. I deserve better. I'm on the inside. Let's make it, meaningful." And so a lot of the potential of citizenship, and I think people who defend citizenship say, well, the reason it's defensible is because it's a vehicle for advancing human dignity, for advancing equality, for ending anti-discrimination. Ending discrimination and ending subordination. So that's the inclusionary part of citizenship. And then the other thing I said is a general statement: is that citizenship is necessary, but it's not sufficient. What do I mean by that? Well, I guess I'm saying is that as long as citizenship is denied to people, then it makes it easier to treat them badly, to discriminate or subordinate them. But we've seen throughout American history that just because someone is a citizen, it's not enough, right? I mean, the whole history of racial discrimination in this country, a whole history of a long history of denying women the right to vote, just to take two examples, is a sign that citizenship is never sufficient. It's a foundation that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Last thing I'll say, and I realize this is like a really long answer to your question, but believe me, I mean, people build entire careers on answering this one question.
I actually thought you were very succinct.
Okay. But the other thing I'll say is that, and this maybe I should have said this at the beginning, but I'm talking about the formal status of citizenship, right? The formal status of citizenship is being a United States citizen, eligible to get a U.S. passport, for example. And so that's what I meant by I said, denial of formal citizenship status has been used to exclude people. The fact that someone is a formal U.S. citizen, and that's their status under law, has been used to be the basis of arguing, hey, I need to be included. I have rights based on that citizenship. And I meant that being a formal citizen is a necessary foundation for treating people with dignity and respect. But it's not enough because we've seen, maybe the unfortunate history of story of U.S. history. It really has been a story of people who are formally U.S. citizens, but are not treated with equal dignity and respect.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. I next wanted to ask you, what are the bases for citizenship in the United States? How do you claim citizenship, or how are you able to acquire it? Just the basics.
Yeah, so there are two ways to get U.S. citizenship. In other words, if you were to interview U.S. citizens, you'd discover that there are really only two ways that they got to be citizens. One is that they were born citizens, and the other is they became citizens. So how are you born a citizen? Well, there's two ways. You can sort of flowchart this. There's two ways you can be born a citizen. One is on the basis of the place you were born, the physical geographical location of your birth, and the other is who your parents are. And so the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution provides that anyone born on U.S. soil, with a couple of exceptions I'll mention in a minute, but the basic rule is people born on U.S. soil are U.S. citizens from the instant of birth. The only exceptions, and the one that's more commonly cited exception, is if your parents are diplomats in the United States, and this is not just everyone who works at an embassy or consulate, but they have a particular kind of a higher, it's a subgroup of those people working in embassies and consulates that are really exempt from the jurisdiction of U.S. laws, and so those kids of those parents are not U.S. citizens. And there's also an exception that children born to enemy occupying forces are not citizens. But so that's how a lot of people become citizens. They're born a citizen. And then how do you get to be a citizen otherwise if you're not born a citizen? Well, that's a process called naturalization. And most people who naturalize do so by application. In other words, they fill out a form and they have to take a test. And this, by the way, is I'm a naturalized citizen. And so I took this test and became a citizen because I was born in Japan and my family came to this country when I was 3 years old. And then that's the citizenship by naturalization. And almost all people who become citizens by naturalization do so by application. And they take an oath of citizenship. This, by the way, costs money, so we can talk about how complicated this can be. But there's also an interesting group of people, and I think a significant group of people in terms of the evolution of the law get automatically naturalized. These are people, and Congress passed a law in 2000 that basically said that if you're essentially in the custody of a parent who brings you to this country as a citizen, and then you automatically get citizenship when you're brought into the country, and this has a lot of relevance for people who've been adopted overseas, and so, for example, I have a niece who was adopted from China, and she became a citizen when she was brought to this country by my brother, who adopted her, and that's true now, but that law is not made retroactive. So birth or after birth, and then birth as parents or where you were born, and then naturalization is through application or automatically. And application, by the way, this last refinement here is that it could be your own application or it could be the application of your parents that might bring citizenship to you automatically as part of their application.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that breakdown. Can you tell us a little bit about the obligations of citizenship? When you become a citizenship, what are your rights? What are your responsibilities? Right. How is that distinguished from the status of a non-citizen?
Yeah, so that's another, really important and question that opens up a lot of ground here. So one way to split up the question is to say, what could you do as a citizen that you couldn't do before you became a citizen? And so I think the one that's sort of often talked about is you have a right to vote as a citizen. That's generally true. It's not universally true. There are places where there are local jurisdictions where you're allowed to vote even if you're not a citizen. It depends on the local jurisdiction. So you can look in certain towns and cities around the country. Not many of them, but there are few. And then San Francisco is an example of a jurisdiction where, and this is not the only one, but a jurisdiction where parents of kids could in the school district could vote in school board elections. But so voting is one. And running for office would be another that's related to being a voter. There are certain kinds of, well, let me skip ahead to something that's equally important, but a very different, maybe even more important, but it's in a different register altogether. And that is that citizens cannot be deported, at least without losing their citizenship first. So this is not a right as much as a protection. Another thing, I'll flip it back to rights here for a second, is that if you're a citizen, you have a much greater ability to petition for and sponsor your relatives to come to the United States. There's a broader group of relatives, a much broader group of relatives that you can sponsor, or the technical word is petition, but to basically bring people over to join your family. So that'll be another one. But there are a lot of things that in the United States, for example, certain kinds of public benefits. There's always, like, this falls on what I said earlier about citizenship is inclusionary and it's exclusionary. There are a lot of things that where the dividing line is between citizens and non-citizens. Voting generally is for citizens. Non-citizens generally cannot vote. But there are other things that where the actual line is citizens and lawful permanent residents are the ones, for example, who are eligible for certain kinds of public benefits. And those are the people on the inside. The people on the outside are people who are undocumented or people who are without and people who are lawfully here as on non-immigrant, semi-temporary statuses. So, okay, so there's the rights, or voting rights would be one example. Protection, bringing people over would be another sort of right, I suppose you could say. In terms of protections, I think the biggest one is the protection against deportation. Although I meant it literally, which is to say you cannot be deported as a citizen, but there are cases of people being stripped of citizenship and then being deported. In terms of responsibilities, I mean, the one that comes to mind is that U.S. citizens are subject to tax obligations under U.S. law, no matter where they live. They may be protected in practice as a practical matter by the fact that if they're paying taxes in another country, they may get credit against U.S. taxes. That's a very complicated thing that, frankly, I don't know that much about the details of. But those are just three examples. Another example is the jury service is generally for citizens, and I suppose a lot of people think of that as more as a responsibility than a right, although it's actually interestingly both. So those are just some examples. The one thing I'll say that though that's I hope it's interesting to me anyway, is that it gets back to this idea that citizenship is a tool for drawing a line between insiders and outsiders. And so a lot of times, depending on the situation, the line that matters can be the line between the citizen and non-citizen. That'll be for voting, for example. But in many other cases, the line that matters is the line between citizens and lawful permanent residents are the insiders, and all other non-citizens, including temporary visitors and the undocumented, they're the outsiders. So we're talking about an insider-outsider line. In a lot of cases, it's citizenship for a lot of rights, responsibilities, and protections. But a lot of times, it's the line not between citizens and non-citizens, but between really some non-citizens are insiders too. Sometimes
Absolutely.
I could say more about that too, but that's kind of what it looks like.
Okay, no, that's a really helpful explanation. And I wanted to ask you about citizenship in comparison. So when you look at the ways in which citizenship operates in the United States and compare it to other models globally, what are some of the things what are some of the elements of US citizenship that are distinct or interesting or fall in a particular place relative to other models? What's specific to the United States?
Yeah, no, that's a really important area of inquiry because it really sheds light. I mean, like in all things, I suppose, if you look at the way it's done in other countries, you get interesting insights into what a country like the United States, I mean, what's choices it's making and things that are, you take for granted are not true in many other countries. And so I'll answer your question literally in terms of other countries, but I also want to tack on to the answer. Please remind me if I forget how it used to be different in US society, right?
Please.
Because you can also compare today in the US with 150 years ago in the US. But in terms of other countries, well, a lot of countries do not accept. In other words, they do not do citizenship based on where you were born. So countries that are typically countries that with a tradition of immigration tend to be the countries that give citizenship to children born on that soil. But a lot of countries in the world, traditionally ones that don't see themselves as countries of immigration, of incoming, welcoming immigrants or having immigrants, they tend to focus more or put more weight, relatively speaking, on who your parents are. And it's handed down by family, by descent, by blood. So that's one big, example of this. And I mean, just to kind of give you an illustration, even though it's kind of a quirky illustration, I mean, my own situation was that I was born in Japan. All my grandparents are Japanese, but my father was born in. Don't worry, this won't be on the exam. But my father was born in San Francisco and grew up in Japan. My mother had always been in Japan. I was born in Japan. So my father, being a U.S. citizen, so I have one U.S. citizen parent, but he hadn't lived in the United States long enough to transmit citizenship to me by blood. So then the question is, why couldn't why couldn't I have Japanese citizenship? Well, partly because Japan does not give citizenship based on birth on U.S. soil. So then what happens is, the next question is, why didn't my mother give me U.S. citizenship? And the reason is that, yes, Japan is one of those countries where citizenship by birth is passed on only through bloodlines, not by the geography of your birth. But in Japan, only the father could transmit citizenship, not the mother, until the 1980s. So I ended up with no citizenship at all. I was actually stateless for the first, until I naturalized when I was a teenager. That's a long kind of personal story, but the main point is that Japan is a country that goes by blood. And so what's happening in a lot of countries around the world is that you're seeing countries that are traditionally countries going on bloodlines, making incremental changes to allow some people born on that soil to become citizens, to automatically be citizens, even if the parents are not citizens. So, for example, I mean, Germany always had a focus on the bloodlines, but more recently, it's come to accept that some people born on German soil have an opportunity, or actually are automatically German citizens. And then some countries have restricted citizenship based on soil that we have in this country. So there's a bit of some of the countries that rely on birth citizenship based on birth on soil have cut that back a little bit, and some of the countries that have based it on bloodlines have opened it up to include people born on that soil. So there's just a lot of different mixes on this. A second thing I'll say that is comparative, but it's important because it's not within the scope of the question how are rules different on getting citizenship and who is a citizen, but it can be even more important, and that is which countries allow citizenship. Well, which countries allow you to be a dual citizen? Some countries accept it. The United States is quite tolerant of dual citizenship, as is the case in a lot of countries. But other countries say, well, we don't think you can be Japanese and another citizen. So that can be very important as well. And the last thing I want to say is something that I just laid the foundation for a minute ago, which is that how is this different? There was a time in U.S. history. I mean, actually, my book "Americans in Waiting" is really about a lot of what I'm about to say. Until about the early 1900s, or even say 1920, to be a good figure to use. The favored treatment of citizens was, we treat citizens well. I mean, we let them vote. But until the early 1900s, non-citizens could vote too. But they could only vote if they had filed the declaration of intent to become a citizen. So in other words, the insiders were the citizens and people who were non-citizens but who'd filed an intent to become a citizen. And so historically, it didn't turn on citizenship. It turned on being a citizen or intending to become a citizen. What was interesting about that, though, and this is a whole other dimension of the history that's important, is that this was very racially determined, right? Because because citizenship was restricted by race until 1952 in the United States. And so what you're really saying is that immigrants who are white immigrants were treated like citizens, but all other non-citizens were not treated like citizens. And so that's just important. I realize I'm complicating with 5 different dimensions here, but
it is
I think,
complicated.
some of this is that different countries have different traditions and different laws on who is a citizen. And they attach different significances to being a citizen. But actually, we've done things differently in US history because the significance of the line has been different. And I think, and there's a long history of racial restrictions in who can become a citizen and who is born a citizen.
That's really powerful to understand a little better. I want to just share a question from one of our audience members in our Zoom chat who's asked, should there be a stateless status? Meaning, is there not any universal right to belong somewhere?
Yeah, it's a great question. And from a moral point of view, a philosophical point of view, and to some extent, even a legal point of view, there should not be stateless people, right? In a world that seems predominantly organized by nation states, and we could talk about the good and the bad of that, but given that the general reality that that a person who is stateless is in a or as Hannah Arendt put it, I mean, they don't have the right to have rights. And so there are lots of instances of laws being adopted or interpreted in certain ways to try to minimize or even eliminate the possibility that someone ends up stateless. But some people are made stateless because they're stripped of citizenship by the country that they fled, or maybe they weren't able to flee even, right? But it happens, and it happened in my case through a quirky set of interactions of 3 or 4 different laws and a lot of complicated personal and family history. I suppose there's some right to belong somewhere, but it wouldn't necessarily be recognized by any country. So that's why it remains abstract, right? When I took one trip as a teenager outside the United States, I went with my mother to visit relatives in Japan, and I'll never forget. I mean, I didn't have a passport. I wasn't eligible for a passport. I traveled on the same document that you travel on if you're a refugee and you've lost your citizenship. But it was recognized as a travel document, at least, by both the Japanese government and by U.S. immigration.
Okay, really fascinating. I wanted to also just think a little bit more about, you raised the question of what's changed in the United States over time. And I think when folks look at contemporary immigration and citizenship debates, there's a great deal of popular focus in the United States about racial tropes about Mexican migrants and more recently Central American migrants. And so when you say immigrant, the kind of stereotypical or implicitly biased assumption people make is that the people we're talking about are Latinx. But when we dive into the 19th century and start to look at immigration laws becoming more restrictive, I'm thinking of like the Page Law of 1875, followed 7 years later by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there was initially a lot of focus on Asian Americans. I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit more about the history of how citizenship has changed and how it's been bound up with race and racism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole, I mean, I think a lot of what I was thinking about when I said that citizenship can be used to exclude or include, and that citizenship is necessary but not sufficient. A lot of what I was thinking is about the racial history of the United States,
Mhm.
um,
The-
because the let's divide that into the same categories I used for thinking about citizenship and who is a citizen. Are you born a citizen? Can you become one? Well, I mean, the citizenship of African Americans by birth wasn't recognized until after the American Civil War. I mean, in many ways, that's what the American Civil War was about. Although, I mean, I'm sure it was about a lot of things, of course, but it was certainly about uh, slavery and more fundamentally the 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 humanity of the African American community and brought over in chains initially. And so, so that's clearly a racial association with race. The Supreme Court decided in the second half of I guess, the last quarter of the 1800s, so late 1800s, that a couple things. One is that U.S. American Indians were not U.S. citizens because at the time they were thought to be subject to the jurisdiction of tribes that were thought of in some sense sovereign enough to kind of confer citizenship that would be different from U.S. citizenship. But the Supreme Court also held, in a case called Wong Kim Ark, that people born who were Chinese, born of Chinese immigrant parents in the United States, they're born in the United States, but their parents are Chinese non-citizens of Chinese ancestry, they are born as U.S. citizens. Okay, but it's not until the different people give different dates to when American Indians became U.S. citizens by birth. Some of it has to do with treaties, some of it has to do with statutes, but it's by the 1924 is a date that's often cited for that, depending on the tribal situation of the particular individual. And then, but on the naturalization side, the naturalization was becoming a citizen, by application. That ended up that was the topic that was addressed by a law passed by Congress and signed by the president in the year 1790. And that law said that naturalization was restricted to free white persons. I mean, just right there in the statute. And then that's expanded to persons of African descent and nativity. That's the language in 1870 after the Civil War. Well, uh, Chinese Americans were excluded. Chinese immigrants were excluded from becoming citizenship eligible until 19. They're excluded in the Chinese exclusion laws, and then they end up only becoming eligible for citizenship in 1943. And racial restrictions are removed from the laws governing naturalization in 1952. So it's most of American history, the ability to apply for citizenship was restricted by race. There's also cases defining whiteness. That's one. And then I haven't even spoken of many other practical barriers to naturalization, including the high cost of naturalizing in terms of the application fees. And I think that, a lot of and this is part of where you started the question, that a lot of the invocation of citizenship and the use of citizenship actually to exclude, has been used and really turned into a weapon by politicians who really seek to demonize immigrants. And I think probably the most prominent example of this is Donald Trump, but he's certainly not the only one, and he wasn't the first, and he unfortunately won't be the last person to hold those views.
One of our audience members is asking the question, does the U.S. Constitution give Congress express power over immigration? In other words, is there any constitutional guidance about how immigration laws should be crafted?
Um, there's no part of the Constitution that actually grants an immigration power in those terms. There are certain clauses of the Constitution that seem to address migration, citizenship, and things like that. Probably the most prominent one is something that gives confers a power, Congress the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. That naturalization should be uniform throughout the country, but that's not necessarily about immigration. Another one is that people talk about the foreign affairs power. That itself is kind of also implied, but some combination of international powers, including war power, implies some control over migration. That people argue about that. Some people say that it's inherent in a nation that the very fact that it's a constitution is, but that's also implied. And there's also a tragic clause involving the importation called migration importation, but that actually is something in the Constitution that addressed slavery. But the founders couldn't bring themselves to use the word slavery in the Constitution, and so they called it migration and importation. But I don't think they were talking about migration in the sense that you're asking the question.
Gotcha. No, that's really useful context. So just a couple last questions. This has been really amazing so far. I want to ask you about contemporary legislation and proposed, changes. What should we take seriously? One of the things that we know, and about a month ago, we did a session of the Civics Project focused on understanding a little bit better how Congress works. And we looked at how we research and find out what bills are introduced. And as you, I'm sure, are aware, in any given session of Congress, there will be hundreds and hundreds of immigration bills introduced, many of them very quickly, and only a very few of them pass. What will pass? We've already seen new bills introduced, mostly from the right, some of them focusing on subjects that you've talked about today, like whether citizenship should continue to accrue to anyone by birth in U.S. soil. But I guess the question I would ask is, given that there's always, at least in our current, national formation, going to continue to be a lot of legislative attention to immigration, what should we actually be watching for? What could change in the next, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? What are likely to be the big struggles?
Well, some of the struggles became evident during the Trump administration. And so to some extent, the really generalized form of your question is, which of the Trump proposals didn't end with the Trump presidency and they're kind of there and have the potential to be pushed in a serious way. And one is the idea of trying to restrict citizenship based on birth on U.S. soil. That became kind of a favorite, kind of a Trump camp, Trump base idea that we should not have citizenship based on U.S. soil. And so there's, I think the consensus in the legal academy, at least, and among lawyers in general, is the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution guarantees this. But, can I guarantee that the Supreme Court is going to hold that that's what the 14th Amendment means? I guess I can't guarantee that, right? So, there's a possibility. I think there are some people who think that they may be pushing for a congressional statute that would then, the constitutionality of which would go to the Supreme Court, right? So that's one issue. So that may be targeting the children of the undocumented. It may be targeting children of people who are in the country legally but only temporarily. I think that the Trump administration was very keen on adding a citizenship question to the U.S. Census. And so that's a different sort of strategy, which is kind of to use citizenship to exclude. It's really saying, well, we're going to take certain things and only count the citizens. We don't care if you live here. We're only going to count the citizens. And so that could be true for everything from appropriations and allocations of funding to states and localities, but it could also be true for who's represented in Congress and in the legislatures. Again, there's a question of what the Constitution requires, and would it require a constitutional amendment, or is it enough for Congress to act? But I think there are people who are pushing those proposals whose hope is that they can get the Supreme Court to say that Congress can change these rules. So I would so I think that the idea of who counts is important, and then there's threats to the expansive recognition of citizenship based on U.S. soil. I mean, those are things that I think a lot of people would have thought were kind of beyond the pale of ordinary discussion and serious conversation. Let's say in the year 2010, but when Trump completely highlighted and emphasized and campaigned to his base on precisely these kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really clarifying. Last question I'd like to pose myself, and of course we may have some more from the audience. Just this past week, you testified before the U.S. House of Representatives, specifically to the subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties, which is part of the Committee on the Judiciary. And the subject of your remarks was discrimination and violence against Asian Americans. And I got to read through your comments. Thank you for sharing them. And one of the things that they did was implicate the relationship between anti-Asian racism, U.S. citizenship, and immigration law and hate crimes. I wondered if you could share a little of that analysis for this audience.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to, thank you for mentioning it. I mean, this was just 3 days ago, right? I mean, this was a hearing on discrimination and hate crimes against Asian Americans. Interestingly, it was a hearing that was planned before we knew what would happen in Atlanta. But of course, these events of crimes has been a real, very tragically, very numerous especially over this last period of time. But it goes back in American history. So what I shared is really, I urged the committee to think about how laws have enabled some of the anti-Asian hate, and what I was asking the committee to take responsibility for was a system of immigration laws and citizenship laws that has laid the foundation for these hate crimes, in my view. And the most functional thing, the way to explain it, is that immigration laws and citizenship laws. So the immigration laws are people who's allowed to come to the country, who gets kicked out, right? Those kinds of things. And citizenship laws that we've been talking about here today. On the surface, I mean, superficially, the first thing you think of is, oh, that keeps people on the outside, who are on the outside, and it defines who's on the inside, right? And there's a lot of ways in which immigration and citizenship laws do this. But what's often overlooked is that immigration law also has, throughout American history, treated some citizens, some people who are on the inside, better than other people who are on the inside. So immigration laws, for many years, kept out Chinese immigrants, for example. The Muslim ban made it very difficult to come to join your family members if you are from these disfavored countries that are defined by a disfavored faith. What those laws do isn't just keep people. It isn't just a dividing line between people out there in a foreign country and people inside the country. What they actually do is to say some citizens get to build families here. Some citizens get to build communities here, and other people don't. You can't bring your family, from Iran, but if you're from another country, you can. That's and for the era of Chinese exclusion that officially went on for over 60 years. It meant that if you're from China, you could be a U.S. citizen, but your citizenship was disfavored because you couldn't sponsor people with the same ancestry, but other people could. And so immigration and citizenship laws discriminate, disfavoring some citizens and favoring other citizens. And that's kind of the foundation for saying that, that those communities and families are not as worthy of respect. And I think that does have a strong influence in the society we have, if that's what the laws say. And unfortunately, the laws have done that in the United States, from the initial laws restricting naturalization to free white persons through Chinese exclusion. One thing also said to I think it also has, this is also related to the way that this country has treated Latino immigration, Latin American immigration historically, and it certainly is the case with the ban on immigration from certain majority Muslim countries and from some prominent African countries as well. So it's all kind of connected, and this is the ways in which citizenship has been used to exclude not just who can become a citizen and who can't, but also who, even if you become a citizen, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be that your loved ones or your community will be allowed to build and thrive.
Thank you. That's a really powerful explanation. I know our audience members have a couple more questions, but we're running very low on time, so we'll maybe try to follow up after the recording. But before we end our recorded session, I wanted to ask you to share reading recommendations. What's a book or an article or two that would be great starting places for people who are trying to learn or think more deeply about the issue of citizenship?
Yeah. If it's okay to recommend stuff I've done.
Please do.
Okay. Because the logical sequence here is that, I wrote them because I wanted to address these questions. And so I think it actually is an honest answer to questions. So I wrote a book called Americans in Waiting. It's called Americans in Waiting. That's the title. And the title is the whole argument. I mean, in a sense, that to talk about how immigrants have been treated as Americans in waiting or not. And that was, and so that's a book that I wrote for kind of a general, it's sort of a book about law, but it's mostly a history book. And it's published by Oxford Press, year 2006. It's available in paperback. And then that book doesn't talk about what it means to be in the country without papers and being undocumented. And so the sequel is addressing that question, and that book is called Immigration Outside the Law. Immigration Outside the Law. It was published by Oxford in 2014. And it really tries to unpack why we have 11 million people in the country without papers, and how it's actually been kind of the logical and probably intended consequence of U.S. policy. There are many other, great books on immigration, but those are the ones I know the best. But I think I can honestly say that they try to cover a lot of ground, and the book and what's cited in those are other books that would follow up on that. And then I have this piece that it's actually still in law review form. I'm going to turn it into a book. It's called The New Migration Law in the Cornell Law Review, year 2020, which really talks about sending country conditions and the relationship between refugee protection and immigration law, and a lot of topics that I've been avoiding for the first two books.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Motomura. And I really want to just express gratitude for your time today. It matters a lot that we start to offer more resources to the general public about how government works in the United States. And I can't think of a more pressing topic than citizenship. So again, just really want to honor and appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for great questions and conversation. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I want to invite our audience to return next weekend for our discussion of state governments. And then for our monthly film screening on March 31st of Lake of Betrayal, which focuses on the U.S. betrayal of its treaty obligations to the Seneca people. And we'll be joined for discussion after that film by Dr. Mishana Goman from the Tonawanda Band of Seneca. So I hope that folks will join us soon. You can check out our events registration page, which is both linked to the audio podcast and sent to all our live registrants to sign up for next events. And we should have the April Civics Project schedule posted soon. And I'm excited to say that we will have a guest joining us next month from the Equal Justice Society. So again, thank you, everybody, and particular thanks to Professor Motomura, and hope to see many of you next week.